So Karen is the chair of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, the committee responsible for integrity of the methods underpinning the Australian Carbon Credit Unit. So welcome, Karen.
Thanks, Lee. All right, folks. Very warm welcome to all of you. Just in case you're in the wrong room, we're going to be talking about nature-based solutions as a critical component to our climate strategies. I have three fantastic speakers to introduce to you, and we're going to go in this order because it makes perfect sense, which will become obvious when we start. By the time you get to the end of it, you're going to go, God, that was awesome. Well done. So we have Paul Mattiazzi, who's the Acting Director of Agriculture, Land and Waste in the Climate Change Authority. Round of applause for Paul. We have Sarah Stevens, Sustainable Land Management Team Leader with Gulf Savannah NRM. And we have Jeremy Mansfield, who's Chair of Green Cross Australia. Now, the format is as follows, colleagues, comrades and friends. My learned colleagues to my left are going to say something to a question which I will pose to them, which they may or may not have heard before. And then they will talk for about 5-6 minutes or so, and they know that I will crash tackle them to the ground should they speak for more than 5 or 6 minutes. And then I will very quickly and deftly turn to you as the audience to ask some engaged and insightful questions. And as some of you will have heard me say before, really good panel discussions are a lot like really good kissing. If one side isn't that enthusiastic, it's just not that much fun, right? So we're going to do our bit. You guys have got to do your bit. So please do have your questions ready. We're spanning three related but distinctive areas with our speakers. But without further ado, I'm going to relocate with this. Right. Paul, I'm not going to read the question. You know what the question is. Set the scene for us, please. Congratulations on your Sectoral Pathways report last week. I have read only the Ag and Land chapter at this point, which is probably appropriate given my job at the moment. But if you could set the scene for us, that the Ag and Land sector is being asked to do a lot in terms of decarbonisation. Huge opportunities, but also, as we've heard from some of the sessions already, quite a bit of angst out there, depending on what's being asked of people and where it's being asked of them and to what extent. So the floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm Paul Mattiazzi. I'm the Acting Director for the Agriculture, Land and Waste section at the Climate Change Authority. And as Karen just alluded, we just last week on Thursday released the Sectoral Pathways report that was requested by the Australian Parliament to chart a pathway for 6 sectors of the economy to achieve net zero by 2050. I've had primary input into the agriculture and land chapter of that. I guess the key takeaways from the report, first of all, it was primarily focused on what technologies were available, and so it is heavily invested in the agriculture component of land use and what new and emerging emissions reductions technologies can be deployed for the agricultural sector. And this is things boxes, feed additives, style, things to address ruminant methane emissions, other technologies applied to reduce emissions from fertiliser, and a whole host of measures around farm energy improvements, renewable energy deployment on the farm, renewable pump powered systems, etc. And questions around mineral management from more intensive livestock production systems. And then in parallel, what we considered the land sector with a primary focus on the nature of the referral from the Senate didn't give a huge scope in terms of our ability to interpret beyond the technologies, but we did consider practice change and also significant issues and barriers around a greater rate of tree planting and establishment in the sector. And that intersects with a whole range of issues around land use, around social licence and identity as farmers and agricultural practitioners, land managers, and how the primary focus of our research looked at how the various incentives and mechanisms operating are not always synergistic. In fact, they can be antagonistic and prevent people taking actions and behaviours that would be considered optimal. And so, yeah, that's, I think, briefly me.
Paul, have you, notwithstanding the media around we should all eat less red meat, which was one line, have you had any feedback, substantive, genuine feedback from the ag and land sector stakeholders? Yeah,
look, we've had a range of positive feedback on the research report and across multiple sectors. And I think the NFF's media release, they call it fair, balanced and well researched, so that's a plus. It is true that there was a discussion in amongst an extensive discussion about the importance of the agriculture sector for Australian food security, its economic value. There was recognition that red meat production is a higher source of emissions than other protein sources, be they chicken, pork, or alternative protein sources. And in the way of the media, that's what seemed to catch their eye. But there is much more to it. And of course, proteins that aren't specifically from a red meat source still require Australian agriculture to produce grains, legumes. So there's a much bigger scope for agriculture to continue to satisfy domestic and global consumers.
All right, thank you, Paul. Hold that thought. I'm sure you'll have questions. Sarah, turning to you now, working with the Gulf Savannah NRM, you obviously work very closely with landholders and agriculturalists up north. Can you set the scene for the audience in terms of what the expectations are around sustainability for those landholders and I suppose the challenges and the opportunities and how you work through them and what you're seeing, and any sort of local stories to flesh it out would, I think, make it more real?
Sure. I am a sustainable land management team leader, so working directly with predominantly pastoralists, but also with other farmers and with our First Nations. So our region is mostly extensive beef grazing. There is cropping, mostly dry land cropping, so rain-fed, where people are growing hay for their own cattle and for their neighbours. And then we have a small area of intensive irrigated tropical agriculture, horticulture as well. NRM hold quite a unique position, I guess, in this discussion, in that we are the ones out there having cups of tea, many cups of tea. And it's not unusual to drive 500 kilometres to have a cup of tea. But that's important because we can't achieve any of our goals if we don't build relationships based on trust and respect with our producers and also with our First Nations peoples. So I guess our goal is really about providing tools and resources to support farmers to adapt and adopt best practice management into their production systems. And we mostly support them to meet the expectations to produce more food and fibre with less resources, while also achieving environmental and economic sustainability. So there's some really big challenges around what our farmers are doing at the moment. The rising cost of productions and decreasing returns, increasing competition with carbon projects and renewable energy infrastructure. They're being told they're both the problem and the solution to climate change. Mandatory climate-related financial disclosures is going to have a big impact on the agricultural supply chain and inevitably for farmers as the point of production. So despite their role in emissions reductions, in carbon sequestration, in natural capital stewardship, not to mention feeding 67.5 million Australians and innumerable people across the globe, they're feeling a bit left out of the conversation. And whether real or perceived, they're also feeling that they're being pushed off the land. And I think it's significant that NFF are rallying today here in Canberra, which I think is probably a manifestation of that feeling. And we probably just need to acknowledge it rather than ignore it. So in preparation for this, I am the secretary of our local grower group, FNQ Sustainable Cropping, a fairly new group. They've only been around for a couple of years and are really just establishing what it is they're trying to achieve and how they're going to achieve that. Obviously, farmers are time poor, so we're working together to try to get some research and trials on the ground in our region. North Queensland often gets neglected by the RDCs. So in preparation, I emailed some of the growers on our group and asked them what they would like me to tell you today. And I'm just going to read direct, if that's okay. My main concern about these climate targets is that it's driving our costs up dramatically, especially for us that irrigate, so use a fair bit of fuel. We are all trying to reduce costs by being more efficient, of course, but these targets are too much pressure. And another one, we are all up for change, but changing the way we do things has huge costs and we're not being compensated for it in the market. It's encouraging more corporate investment as they have the investors and resources to deal with this. It's putting so much pressure on small farms and businesses. Most guys have nearly had enough. Farmers are always looking at ways to protect their soils, the environment and their bottom line. A farmer that is profitable won't cut corners to make ends meet. It's also important to note that Mother Nature throws up unforeseen challenges every year and farmers need to have the tools and flexibility to be able to manage the impacts of weather more reliably. And this is about research and on-ground trials. So these guys are in a group called Sustainable Cropping. So they're, conventional, but they're definitely transitioning to better practices. They know that they have to make changes to the way they do things. But I think there's a lot coming at them. And for a family farm, again, very time poor and margins are pretty narrow. So the opportunities, Gulf Savannah believes that best management practice results in good natural resource outcomes. We're part of a CRC Northern Australia, which is the North Queensland Cotton Grains Cattle Project. And in that project, we're looking at the sustainability of diversification of extensive beef grazing country into cropping and what are the trade-offs and benefits for the environment and the resilience of the local cattle industry. So part of that is developing a self-assessment sustainability tool, which is really specific to FNQ growers and the environment and our conditions. And the approach has involved translating the complexity of sustainability frameworks, targets, indicators, criteria, and if anyone's had a look at the cotton, the beef, the grains, and the Australian agricultural sustainability frameworks, for a producer, that's just,
nonsense.
It is, yeah, thank you. So what we've done is tried to translate that, pull all the environmental practices out of it and turn it into language and practice that makes sense for our producers in our regions, and helping them recognise that a lot of the stuff they're already doing is sustainability indicators in action. It's more about recognising that and I guess recording that so that in the future they can demonstrate it if requested. And so whether that's soil management, pasture management or stock management, we're trying to set up ways to help them document that in a way that's not time consuming, doesn't require a consultant, and that they can be able to produce something if requested from their bank or the person that's buying their product. There's always room for improvement. I'm not saying that our producers are all best practice gold standard, but they are working to improve. And so by working to establish that baseline data on their current practices, we can identify the areas that need improving in our region and their alignment or not with the sustainability goals. So if we want farmers to play the role that we're expecting them to play in this transition, we need to support them. And I'm not even talking about financial support. For a family farm, big change is difficult and stressful, particularly if there's multiple generations working the farm. Changing farming practices involves significant costs and risks, and currently that burden sits entirely on the farmers, which is neither equitable or sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah. Before I go to Jeremy, a quick follow-up. These cups of tea. It is a serious question. Do they seek you out, or are you finding them? So, the role of the NRM in that space, is it push or pull? If you can answer that quickly, because Jeremy's dying to say something.
It's a little bit of both. Obviously, we seek them out because we exist on government funding, and so we get a project and then we need to go out to our producers and say, hey, could you help us out with this? So there's a fair bit of that, but we also do get them ringing us up. What are the resources? What's available? How can you help me? I want to do this. Give me some information. So it's a little bit of both.
All right, hold that thought. I'm sure there'll be questions. Jeremy, last but not least, I know you're very, very passionate about green and blue infrastructure and the co-benefits that that investment offers, particularly with respect to climate adaptation. Do you want to set the scene for the audience about what those opportunities are and how they might be better valued and recognised?
Right. And it's certainly a flip, because obviously we've been talking about mitigation and other aspects, and adaptation has been a bit missing in action in terms of valuing it, in terms of the benefits it provides. And certainly nature-based solutions, as the UN's kind of framed it around 3 areas, has started to really resonate in certainly the resilience and adaptation sector, which has known the benefits for a long time, but actually joining it up with the engineers of the world to understand, well, how does it contribute to living infrastructure that's not just about the stuff that we build, it's built form, but provide the ability to kind of manage various hazards and various outcomes that actually we all want, without actually expending both the resources and the embodied emissions that comes into building all that kind of infrastructure. So certainly across the biodiversity, conservation and restoration and preservation, though that the first element of that is just really connecting and understanding the biodiversity and ecosystem services that can be provided by understanding the kind of value of nature-based systems. Secondly, the mitigation and adaptation value of nature-based systems is a really central part of it. A lot of it's been captured on the mitigation side and the carbon credit schemes. And going, yes, we know what carbon sequestration is, but the value that the nature-based systems can provide to urban heat, to urban flooding, to soil carbon, to a number of aspects that actually really change the dynamics of dealing with both acute and chronic scenarios for climate is kind of like very well understood by some, but not connected into the finance value proposition at this point. In the finance taxonomy, they're still going, let's talk about carbon, but then we're missing the value that comes as a contribution to that. So we're kind of not valuing the other contribution it can make. And the third part is the socio-economic benefits of nature-based solutions that actually support agricultural land management practices as well as urban infrastructure, really identify the value it provides for food, for water security, for health, for thriving communities. So those 3 aspects of biodiversity, climate mitigation, and socio-economic benefits, nature-based solutions provide that in spades. And certainly a lot's been said around kind of green infrastructure. We hear about green roofs, but green spaces, etc. But certainly the underlying bit around soil carbon and the value that that actually contributes to capture water, hold it, filter it, prevent erosion, prevent sediment runoff. There's a number of things that kind of aren't really identified and valued in different ways. And then you start to look at the the urban flooding side of it, where you go, well, actually, yes, you could do a whole bunch of planting of trees, but if they're planted in the wrong place and actually slow situations where it actually is an area that needs to, has greater flows of water, then it actually is a maladaptation scenario where we've gone, oh, we thought we'd done the right thing, but actually these trees have grown into massive tree trunks, and in fact, we planted in the wrong location. So we have to have a joined up understanding of the system dynamics so that we don't go and plant and do one thing to see it's adding value and then cause another problem in another part of it. And I think that's the challenge, getting that right, and then contributing to the blue infrastructure side of it is really understanding what rivers, lakes, ability to hold water to help to bring healthy water cycles back, because we're so focused on getting the water away because that causes flooding, whatever, not realising that natural systems need water and we're starving them, and if we're not careful, we're kind of using water and not accounting for it and using that to actually part of a living system. And I think mimicking how nature works is the benefit that provides us with. So rather than being a static environment, it actually can adapt and thrive, but not if it's been starved. So there's a few kind of examples there to draw upon, and I think it's just trying to change the narrative going. It's not just about solving one. We actually need a whole system approach to some of these things, because one can lead to a bad unintended consequence of another. And if we're going to have land management practices, then you've got to have good soil carbon, you've got to have good water cycles to work, as well as if we actually need less resources to build more grey infrastructure, then we're actually doing a good thing there. We're listening to what carbon work, and we're allowing nature to help to adapt as it can through different stages of the climate as it occurs. So there's a need to kind of recognise it and move it from nice, good guideline principles into actually what's practice, and how do we join that up and get the engineers in the room with the ecologists to start doing planning in a joined up manner, not seeing it as silos, which we seem to still have in every sector report I read. They don't connect the dots between what should be actually happening across the sectors and also the investment flows to make that work. So,
Thank you, Jeremy. Two things. You must miss NCARF as much as I do. That was a fantastic research effort. For how many years did NCARF go on for? 6, 7 years? What a loss. And then the other is just that final point around silos and making sure that we have holistic land management practices and approaches. I did pick up in the CCA review of the ACCU scheme that was released in December last year, the recommendation that NRM organisations and their plans be referenced as being, let me put that a different way, that if you're going to run an ACCU project in a region, you need to have referred to the relevant NRM plan and sought advice for the relevant NRM organisation to make sure that what you're doing with that project might be kicking goals in terms of sequestration, but you could potentially be undoing something else, which speaks to your point. I'm going to shut up because they deliberately made me a moderator. So, colleagues, we're going to have questions from you. Heads up, Eleanor, person in the audience I know, so if no one asks one, I'm going to you. I do. Hello, Amanda. Amanda was doing unbelievably good communities in transition work before anybody else in Queensland, so anytime I see you, I always think back to those days. 2017, before anyone else was saying it. Now, you're going to need one of these.
We had a really lively discussion in our last session around First Nations people, and I was just thinking, like, in this position, a lot of the climate work that's being done is focused on farming, and there's a lot more work to be done there. But the role of First Nations people on country, and where there's potential to tap into things like finance to, so where is that coming into these discussions, particularly with the CCA, I guess? I was curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely, and a great question. Not so much in the Pathways report just released, which have this technology focus, but certainly in the ACCU scheme review from last year, there was a recognition that more investment and assistance should be available for First Nations projects to be developed and run, and become so I'm sorry. The intent is that there's a lot of great knowledge available in First Nations communities through First Nations culture and practice, and that knowledge has to be integrated and respected in the other programs that are deployed and become integral to running these projects. And so there are questions around what sort of capabilities and culturally appropriate training can be provided and developed. There's the respect of First Nations knowledge, cultural knowledge and practice, but broader than that, an extension to First Nations science, which is what it is in that cultural knowledge context. It's a response to environment and adaptation. And so how those lessons can be integrated better for projects around natural resource management and land management. So I've gone around to circle there, sorry.
But I can weigh in as chair of IRAC. So we spent a good period of time at the beginning of the year thinking about the way in which our piece of the puzzle could be revised and reformed in order to enable greater uptake and participation of First Nations people in ACCU methods. So we're just on a journey of writing a First Nations inclusion strategy led by Suzanne Thompson, who's our First Nations member on the committee. But it has a number of elements to it. One is, for those of you that watch my space in particular, we have the proponent-led method development process underway at the moment. We've explicitly asked proposers of new methods to indicate, first of all, have you talked to anyone from the First Nations community or communities so far, and what is the potential of this method with respect to empowerment and uptake and participation. The other piece is around what Paul talked to, traditional ecological knowledge. Not just gaining it, but ensuring that we're giving back for it. And some of that is around the design of methods. So you all know that the vast majority of the land sector methods in the scheme focus on farmers and agriculture and therefore exclude, with the exception of the Savannah farm management method. So what we're looking at is, are there existing methods that could be tweaked in order to be able to empower greater First Nations inclusion, or are there new methods that we haven't thought about yet that ought to be considered and developed in the coming years, subject to the offsets, integrity standards and all the rest of it. But I think this is one of the areas where the Chubb review really weighed in well, and certainly the piece of the puzzle that I am involved with, which is the method design. We've taken it and we're running with it, and all due credit to Suze for not doing it again, aren't I? Right, another question?
Thank you so much, panel, for the conversations. Taurus Webb here from CSIRO, part of the Ag 2050 program, particularly looking at caring for country and agriculture. I really enjoyed what you were sharing there, Jeremy, just the whole view and approach to looking at land, and how when there's a healthy country, there's a healthy people, and mimicking and understanding the stories within the landscape to best look after it. We heard it from Yarrabingan this morning. I'm really interested to hear what were the communities saying during the cups of tea, like, rather than just thinking, okay, there's importance for capacity, capability development. There's also a deep understanding of some of the native grains that are there. I know there's some great leadership happening with harnessing the technology and understanding from lightning, with rain stick, and some urban indigenous farming that's happening out there. What are the communities saying, the indigenous peoples throughout the Gulf, of what they want to see and how they want to be involved?
So I think it's important to note that 20 new Indigenous land and sea ranger programs were funded this year. So we're working with the Tagalaka Rangers in their very first year of being a full-time ranger program. At the moment, it's all about training and getting them the skills to be able to work on Tagalaka National Park, which was just recently renamed from Littleton National Park. So it was a very, very exciting and proud moment for the community. I think they're really interested in, so I guess for them, cool burning is a really, really important way of managing their landscape. We're going to help them get a lot of training. So Fire Sticks is offered to do the training for them and to develop a whole of park plan. But there's a lot of stations around the region who are also trying cool burning as a way of reducing sort of weed thickening and weed control, also pasture improvement, and are not necessarily getting it right. So it's a real science and skill, and that knowledge of when to burn and you know, just I don't understand the science myself, but having discussed it with different fire sticks, I'm like, wow, okay, yeah, this is complex. You really need to know what you're doing to get the outcome that you want. So we're hoping that the Ranger Group will then be able to go out and show and teach the stations in the region about those skills. So it's a goal. We have to get them trained up first, but I think that's a really great way of extending that knowledge out into the community and getting an impact on the ground, because you see stations who will do full burning and go, oh, it doesn't work. And it's more than likely because they just didn't understand what they were doing.
Hello, everyone. Shout out to Karen, my environment policy lecturer from way back in the day. I'm Eleanor. I'm here with the Australian Local Government Association. And I suppose shout out also to the local governments who are here today, and also the other associations who are really keen to be involved and oftentimes doing quite a lot of proactive work in kind of space, the deconstructing the silos, how do we push it forward type space. The Australian government's doing a heap at the moment. So there's obviously the net zero sector plans that are happening that'll kind of filter up into one big plan. There's the ACCU scheme that's, you know, you're looking at, Karen. There's also a nature repair market, developing its methods. I think, Sarah, what you were saying about what landholders are experiencing really resonated from what we hear from local governments of how do we interpret all of these standards, expectations, you know, all of the feedback from all these different places telling us to be everything and do everything because they're based in place and they're accessible. I suppose I have it's really one question, which is any ideas, opportunities, limitations that you see for the whole panel on how we can make all of these things more digestible for those who are using them on the ground, noting that everyone's got different capacity to use them or engage with them. There's so many opportunities to, you know, for example, derive, more income or revenue from the work that's already being done to achieve kind of national outcomes or community outcomes, or I suppose to do all the messy work that, you know, we've been learning about with the last panel around making sure people feel that they're present and empowered and heard when these big changes are happening. So I'm not sure that that's a coherent question, but yeah.
I'm just going to jump in for a quick plug. Utilise the NRM network. We're already there. We cover the whole continent, and we already have the relationships. So utilise us.
It was more coherent than my last answer. But just a point that has come to mind around in our stakeholder engagement and consultation processes, one of the things that we did was that in the scope of those trusted voices, which the other panel was talking about, where land managers and farmers get their advice from, the area groups were featured strongly in that. So in terms of simplifying the complexity, I think there's a responsibility on various government agencies and departments to have a very good look at the policies that they enact and deliver, and work beyond their silo to understand how it integrates or links with another program that offers a grant or the ACCU scheme. Now, when we talk about stacking methods up, how we can reduce the complexity along the way, not just add to it. And that is a real challenge because there is that silo, and there's also just a lack of time. And also sometimes a lack of knowledge about how things actually work on the ground. So it looks great on paper, it doesn't resonate properly on the ground. And that's where getting that feedback and even going out and seeing it can make those moments of connection where people realise, is it talking to two different things, but they're actually the same thing. And so you can reconcile requirement to a prohibition that prevents you achieving both outcomes simultaneously?
I think it's continue to identify how to have joined up conversations. Actually, I was on a roundtable forum this morning with Natural Hazards Research Australia with some called talking nature-based positive solutions for disaster risk reduction. But who wasn't in the room? The engineers, the local councils, the other people in the planning side. So they had people that are in the bubble and understand the value proposition, but not the others that they need to actually bring along for that journey. So I think it's just continue to connect the dots and don't try and solve every problem, because I look at the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosure, for example, and it's got 37 metrics or whatever, and you go a bit like mandatory disclosure. It's like we might end up in a period of reporting a lot and maybe not doing a lot because we're too focused on accountability rather than action. And so I'm a little bit concerned as a person that wants to get stuff done that we need practical action, and yes, we need to be accountable for that, but actually if we spend all of our time trying to get all of those reporting metrics right, and I've spent a lot of years doing that in a corporate sense, and go, there's a lot of work, and if we're not making progress in the next 5, then we've maybe lost a window to actually make a lot of progress. So it's kind of get started, get doing, and by all means be accountable, but don't get caught up in reporting itis to a point where you're not actually making progress.
I'd just say it's Paula Kensington here, and I am maybe the only accountant in the room, but I really like what you're saying there, and I think I just want to also say that the mandated reporting is really important for the CFO to actually have it land firmly on their table, because finance is about 10 years late to this party, and it's only because of mandated reporting that they can now understand that change has to happen. So when you're looking for business cases and you're looking for you have to absolutely say to the CFO, it's now firmly on your radar because you have to report this. So I need funding to go off and do X, Y, Z. So I know it's a lot to do, but I think it's good that we've got it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to be a very interesting transition in the next 3 to 5 years, because I've spent some time with a number of ASX listed companies that are not at the top tier of doing reporting yet, and they're still only talking about what we need to do as a minimum. Yeah. So you kind of go, we've got a long journey to go. So.
Right, who wants the last word? Oh, he's got a microphone.
I think it's me. Paul, you mentioned some of the limitations to the sort of scope of the sectoral pathways report. Had you been asked a broader question, what are some of the solutions that might have made it into a different report? And in particular, are there any, and maybe this is a question for the whole panel, are there sort of solutions that are sitting there but maybe that the government's, for whatever reason, not currently willing to talk about?
On the first one, we bent the scope of inquiry as best we could to also consider questions about practice change, which we saw as part of the broader question when we're talking about technology deployment. What would have made it in a broader framed inquiry? As a CCA union, we tend to research before we respond. So I'm not going to answer that one right now. But our colleagues who probably have some good ideas about what should be included in the next one. I think the other thing is to have a look back at the annual progress report from 2023 that the CCA produced, and the ACCU scheme and NGIS scheme reviews for a much broader look at where further improvements and policy development is starting.
Well, I was just going to say, if you're going to value co-benefits, socio and economic and carbon credits, then the value of adaptation must be there. It's an obvious gap. We actually know that avoided costs and disasters worth $6 to $1 spend. Actually, the US Chamber of Commerce just put out another piece now saying that actually the economic benefits are another $7. So that's actually for every dollar, there's $13 for benefits to avoided and economic benefits to communities. And we're actually valuing that at zero. And even at the moment, when you look at long-term change and adaptation, it has a return period that could be 5, 10, 20 years. But anything that's more than the year return is impossible to get investment type thing. So that's why it's been challenging in the building code, and that's why major repair and other things will need other metrics to value it as a long-term change.
All right, was it good for you? Yeah. Awesome. Join me in thanking the panelists, please.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Karen, and of course the rest of the panel. I've just got, before we go to lunch, a few things to remember for after lunch if you can. We'll be back after lunch at 1:30. But there will be, whether you're interested in repowering homes and communities or creating climate-ready communities, or green metals and manufacturing, there'll be a few different sessions. For repowering our homes, head over to the gallery, which is across the courtyard where we started very briefly this morning. For climate safe and ready communities, head to the Mediatek. So you might have to ask some people for some directions to the Mediatek. And you can join the conversation on just transitions and green metals. Go to the Theaterette, which is where we are now. So that's after lunch at 1:30. Please thank the panel again and thank you for your questions.